There's a sword in a German museum right now that shouldn't exist. I'm not being dramatic. I mean, it literally violates what we know about medieval metallurgy. Its metal is centuries ahead of its time. So advanced it defies everything we know about medieval craftsmanship. We're talking about steel that requires temperatures of 3000 degrees Fahrenheit. In an era when European furnaces maxed out at maybe 2000 degrees. How did a Viking blacksmith create industrial-grade steel in the 9th century? That's just weapon number one. And trust me, it only gets weirder from here. So let's talk about these Ulfberht swords. We've found about 170 of them across Europe and Russia. They all have this inscription, plus VLFB plus T stamped right into the blade. For context, most Viking swords from this period were, let's be honest, kind of garbage. Soft iron that bent in battle. Brittle edges that chipped. You'd be lucky if your sword lasted through one serious fight. But Ulfberht swords? Completely different league. When modern researchers analyzed these blades, they found something that made no sense. The carbon content was perfectly distributed at about 1.2%. That's the sweet spot for high-quality steel. Not too brittle, not too soft. But here's the problem. Achieving that requires crucible steel technology. You need to heat the metal to temperatures medieval European furnaces simply couldn't reach. We're talking 3000 plus degrees Fahrenheit. The Vikings were working with bloomery furnaces that topped out around 2000 degrees. And it's not just the temperature. You need to remove all the slag, the impurities in the iron ore. Medieval European iron was notoriously dirty, full of phosphorus and other junk that weakened the metal. The Ulfberht swords? Almost zero slag. Industrial Revolution level purity. So where did this technology come from? Some researchers think the Vikings were importing steel from the Middle East or Asia, where crucible steel techniques existed. Maybe through trade routes along the Volga River. That would explain the materials, but not the forging technique. Because you can't just buy steel and stamp it into a sword. Someone in Europe had to know how to work with this material. How to fold it. How to heat treat it without destroying it. These are skills that supposedly didn't exist in Europe for another 800 years. And then there's this. We've found fake Ulfberht swords. Cheap knockoffs with misspelled inscriptions like VLFberht without the crosses. Made from regular crappy medieval steel. Which means someone was counterfeiting these weapons because they were that valuable. One more thing. We have no idea who Ulfberht was. Was it a person? A workshop? A brand name? We found these swords spanning 200 plus years and thousands of miles. That's multiple generations. Was it a family secret? A guild? Nobody knows. What we do know is that owning an Ulfberht sword meant you were somebody important. These weren't average weapons. They were the Ferraris of medieval warfare. But here's what keeps me up at night. If the Vikings had access to this technology, why didn't it spread? Why didn't it revolutionize European metalworking? It's like someone opened a door to the future, forged these incredible weapons, and then the knowledge just vanished. Back into the mist. And speaking of vanished knowledge, you haven't seen anything yet. Because there's a blade in Japan that's been called the Sword of God. And the man who made it? He might have actually achieved something close to perfection. But then his masterpiece disappeared. For 150 years. In Japanese culture, there's a swordsmith who's basically considered a deity. His name was Goro Nudo Masamune. He worked during the late 1200s and early 1300s, and his blades weren't just weapons, they were spiritual objects. The Japanese believed Masamune's swords had virtue, that they would refuse to cut an innocent person. There's a famous legend. Someone puts two swords in a stream, one made by Masamune, one by his rival Muramasa. Leaves float down the river. The Muramasa blade cuts everything that touches it. The leaves, the air, everything. But the leaves flowing toward the Masamune blade? They part around it. The sword refuses to cut needlessly. Now, that's mythology. But here's what's real. Masamune revolutionized Japanese sword making with a technique we still don't fully understand. Most Japanese swords are made by forge welding together different types of steel. Hard steel for the edge, soft steel for the core. This creates that beautiful wavy line you see on katanas, the Hammon line. Masamune perfected something called nai, these crystalline structures in the steel that look like stars in a night sky when you examine the blade closely. Modern metallurgists have analyzed his technique and found he was manipulating grain structures at a microscopic level. How? We don't entirely know. He was creating differential hardening patterns so complex that modern swordsmiths, with all our technology, struggle to replicate them. And he was doing this with 13th century technology. Of all Masamune's creations, one stood above the rest, the Honjo Masamune, named after General Honjo Shigenaga, who won it in battle in the 1500s. This sword became a symbol of the Tokugawa shogunate. It was passed down from one shogun to the next for over 250 years. Owning it meant you ruled Japan. When World War II ended, the Tokugawa family handed it over to the American occupation forces, as required. They gave it to a police station in 1945, where it was logged and stored with other surrendered weapons. And then, it vanished. I'm serious. The most valuable sword in Japanese history. A national treasure worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. Gone. Some people think it was taken by an American soldier as a war trophy. There are theories it's sitting in someone's attic in Kansas or Michigan, completely unrecognized. Others believe it was destroyed during the chaos of post-war occupation. The Japanese government has been quietly searching for it for almost 80 years. There's no official reward posted, but if you could prove you had it, your grandchildren would never need to work. But here's what really haunts historians. We have detailed records of what the Honjo Masamune looked like. The exact measurements, the precise curve, the Hammon pattern. And from those descriptions, metallurgists say it represented the absolute pinnacle of what's possible with forge-welded steel. Masamune had figured out something that we, with our electron microscopes and computer-controlled furnaces, still can't quite replicate. It's not lost technology in the sense that we don't understand the basic principles. It's lost mastery. The difference between knowing how music theory works and being Mozart. There's one more thing I need to mention. Remember how Masamune blades were supposed to have virtue? Well, Muramasa blades, made by his rival, were said to be cursed. Bloodthirsty. They would drive their owners to madness and violence. The Tokugawa family actually banned Muramasa swords because so many Tokugawa shoguns were killed with them. They believed the swords were literally cursed against their family line. Now, the Honjo Masamune was supposed to be a good sword. Virtuous. Protective. But it disappeared the same year nuclear weapons were first used. The same year Japan surrendered. The same year an empire fell. Makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, it knew its time was over. But we're just getting started. Because if you think a missing Japanese sword is weird, wait until you hear about the Aztec weapon that terrified Spanish conquistadors so badly they wrote home describing it as demonic. It's in the British Museum right now. And when you understand how it works, you'll realize why the Spanish were so freaked out. But before that, I really need your help. We are trying to hit 1,000 subscribers and only a few are left. So if you can hit the subscribe button, that would be a great help. Moving on. Picture this. It's 1519. You're a Spanish conquistador in gleaming steel armor. You've got a steel sword, a crossbow, maybe a musket. You're convinced you're technologically superior to these savages you're about to conquer. And then you see an Aztec warrior coming at you with, what is that thing? It looks like a wooden cricket bat. But embedded along both edges are razor-sharp blades of obsidian, volcanic glass. And this warrior is swinging it like a two-handed club. One of those blades connects with your buddy's neck. His head comes off. Through the armor. The Macuahuitl, roughly pronounced Macuahuitl, was essentially a Mesoamerican chainsaw sword. A flat wooden club about 3 to 4 feet long with grooves carved along the edges. Obsidian blades were fitted into these grooves and secured with natural adhesive made from plant resin and bitumen. Obsidian is sharper than any metal blade humans have ever created. Under a microscope, a steel scalpel edge looks like a saw. An obsidian blade? A smooth, unbroken line just a few molecules thick. It can split a human hair lengthwise. Modern surgeons actually use obsidian scalpels for delicate procedures because they cause less scarring than steel. That's how sharp we're talking. Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote about seeing an Aztec warrior decapitate a horse with a Macuahuitl in a single strike. He described the weapon cutting through the horse's neck as if it were a lettuce. Another Spanish account describes a Macuahuitl strike that cut through a man's neck to the vertebrae in one blow. These weren't exaggerations. The Spanish were genuinely terrified of these weapons. Here's the thing. Spanish steel armor was basically invincible against most Native American weapons. Stone clubs? Bounced off. Arrows? Usually deflected. But obsidian moving at high speed? It could find the gaps in armor. And when it connected with flesh, it didn't just cut, it filleted. Now we need to talk about why the Aztecs designed this weapon the way they did. It wasn't primarily meant to kill people. The Aztec Empire ran on human sacrifice. Thousands of people per year, possibly tens of thousands during special ceremonies. And you can't sacrifice dead people, you need prisoners. Living, intact prisoners. The Macuahuitl was designed to incapacitate and maim, not kill. Those obsidian blades could slice through muscle and tendon, crippling an opponent without necessarily killing them. You could take someone's leg out from under them and they'd survive long enough to be dragged back to Tenochtitlan. But obsidian has one fatal flaw: it's brittle. After a few solid hits, those blades would shatter. The weapon would need to be re-edged, sometimes in the middle of battle. Spanish steel swords might dull, but they wouldn't explode into fragments. This is probably why the Aztecs eventually lost. Not because their weapons weren't effective, they absolutely were, but because they weren't durable. You can't sustain a long campaign with weapons that need constant maintenance. There's a Macuahuitl in the British Museum that dates to right around the conquest period. When researchers examined it, they found traces of organic material in the grooves, possibly blood or tissue residue. They didn't test it, for ethical reasons, but the implication is clear. This weapon was used. Looking at it in person is unsettling. It's beautifully crafted. The wood is carved with intricate designs. The obsidian blades are still wickedly sharp after 500 years. But you can't shake the knowledge of what it was for. Here's the sad part. We don't actually know exactly how these weapons were made anymore. The Spanish systematically destroyed Aztec military knowledge. They melted down metal weapons, burned codices, executed warriors who refused to convert. Modern researchers have tried to recreate Macuahuitls using historical descriptions and the few surviving examples. And while they can make something that looks right, they're not sure they're getting the details correct. The type of wood, the adhesive formula, the precise angle of the obsidian blades. It's another case of lost mastery. We can copy the form, but not the function. One more thing. Imagine being a Spanish soldier and watching your friend get decapitated by a primitive wooden sword. After you were told these people were backwards, uncivilized. The psychological impact must have been devastating. The Spanish won through disease, superior tactics, and native alliances. But in hand-to-hand combat, the Macuahuitl was absolutely competitive with European steel. If things had gone differently, if the Aztecs had developed bronzeworking or metalworking, history could have been very different. But speaking of history could have been different, there's an artifact in a small creationist museum that, if authentic, would mean everything we know about human history is wrong. I'm talking about a hammer, embedded in 400-million-year-old rock. Yeah, let's talk about the London Hammer. June 1936. London, Texas. A couple named Max and Emma Hahn are walking along a creek bed after a flood. Emma notices a piece of wood sticking out of a rock formation. They bring it home. 10 years later, in 1946, their son cracks open the rock. Inside, an iron hammer with a wooden handle, partially fossilized, embedded in Ordovician limestone dated to approximately 400 million years ago. Humans didn't exist 400 million years ago. Neither did dinosaurs. This was the era of primitive fish and early land plants. The most complex life on Earth was basically trilobites and prehistoric sharks. So what's a manufactured iron hammer doing in a 400-million-year-old rock? Right now, This hammer is in the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose, Texas. The museum's director, Carl Bohr, claims it's proof that humans coexisted with dinosaurs, or that the Earth is much younger than science believes. They've had the hammer analyzed by researchers friendly to their position and claim the iron has an unusual composition: 96.6% iron, 2.6% chlorine, 0.74% sulfur, with no carbon. They say this is too pure for modern metallurgy and proves it was made by a more advanced ancient civilization. The wooden handle has allegedly partially petrified, with the wood fibers replaced by silica, which they claim proves great age. Okay, deep breath. Let's talk about what mainstream science says. First, the rock. That Ordovician limestone? It's not a solid 400-million-year-old time capsule. Limestone formations often develop concretions, mineral deposits that form around objects over time. This can happen relatively quickly, geologically speaking. An iron hammer dropped in 1880 could easily be encased in limestone by 1936 if conditions were right. We're talking 56 years, not 400 million years. Second, the metallurgy. That unusual composition? It's not that weird. High-purity iron does occur naturally in some ore deposits. And the absence of carbon doesn't mean it's ancient. It means it's not steel. It's just iron. Possibly wrought iron from the late 19th century. The chlorine and sulfur could be from the rock formation itself, contaminating the analysis. Third, the petrified wood. Wood can become mineralized surprisingly quickly under the right conditions. We're talking decades, not millions of years, especially if it's been soaking in mineral-rich water. Here's what makes this almost certainly not a 400-million-year-old artifact. The hammer design is consistent with 19th century American mining tools. Nothing about it looks unusual or advanced. The Creation Evidence Museum won't allow independent analysis by mainstream scientists. They've had friendly researchers look at it, but no peer-reviewed studies. The fossilization is superficial. It's surface mineralization, not true fossilization. There's no documentation of the discovery. No photographs from 1936. No witnesses besides the Hahn family. But here's the thing. Even though this is almost certainly just an old hammer that got encased in a limestone concretion, the idea of it is fascinating. Because if it were real, if we found a genuine manufactured artifact in 400-million-year-old rock, it would mean either humans are way older than we think, or there was another intelligent species on Earth before us, or time travelers, or aliens, or something equally reality-breaking. Let's play that game for a second. What if you found a real, verified, undeniable manufactured tool in Ordovician limestone, you'd have to throw out everything we know about evolution, geology, and human history. The entire scientific establishment would collapse. And this is the more interesting possibility. You'd have to accept that a previous technological civilization existed on Earth hundreds of millions of years ago, and all evidence of them was wiped out by geological processes. There's actually a thought experiment about this called the Silurian hypothesis. It asks, if an industrial civilization existed on Earth millions of years ago, what traces would remain? Answer: probably very few. Maybe some geological anomalies. Unusual isotope ratios in rock layers. But no buildings, no tools, no artifacts. Everything would be ground to dust and subducted into the mantle. So the London hammer probably isn't 400 million years old. But the fact that we can't be 100% certain, the fact that our dating methods for objects encased in rock formations aren't perfect, that's interesting in itself. There could be things embedded in rocks around the world that would challenge our understanding of history. And we'd never know unless someone cracked them open. Museums are full of artifacts we don't fully understand. Objects that don't quite fit the narrative. They're usually explained away or ignored because they're inconvenient. The London hammer is probably one of those. A 19th century tool that got cemented into rock and became a curiosity. But that probably is doing a lot of work. Because we don't know for sure. We just know what's most likely. And in science, most likely isn't the same as definitely. So there you have it. For weapons that shouldn't exist, or shouldn't exist the way they do. If you like these type of documentaries, make sure to subscribe.